What if you knew for certain that you were living in a simulation? Imagine it was just a well-known fact that we are all part of the Matrix. Would your own personal code of morality change? Would the things we care about on a societal level have to be adjusted? How would that change how we look at history and what has happened in the past? Philosophers have been thinking about this question for pretty much as long as people have been thinking, and one of the first and most famous examples of this idea of being in a simulation and how that might affect the way we should live personally and the way we might structure society comes from Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I'd be willing to bet most people listening to this now are somewhat familiar with the Allegory of the Cave. If you aren't, it's very easy to find and only a couple of pages long, so it's a quick read, but obviously it has incredible meaning and controversy and intrigue, all of the things that make a story good, and in my view at least, it's worth reading. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he's often regarded as one of the first and most well-known philosophers of all time. He influenced generations of philosophers and leaders to come. He wrote books. He founded the Academy, which was a famous and long-running school for thinking and learning. His credentials are well respected by most serious thinkers, even if they don't agree with everything he said. And probably his most famous and popular work is the Allegory of the Cave. It's found in a book of his called The Republic, where Plato outlines his vision of ethics and society and all that good stuff. Much is often made about the context of the book and the context of the Allegory of the Cave, which is that Plato was influenced in the writing of what he made by the death of his friend and mentor Socrates. So Socrates was put to death by the Athenian government, basically the Athenian democratic system, for quote-unquote corrupting the youth and generally being a pain to certain groups of people in Athens by questioning them and forcing them to examine their belief systems and their ethical values. That's a story for another day, but at any rate, the Allegory of the Cave is Plato at his best, creating a thought experiment that will challenge anyone's belief system and force them to think about the way they view the world. I think it makes sense to start with a description of the cave. It's interesting to note that throughout the Allegory of the Cave and some of his other works, Plato talks through the character of Socrates, who he often puts in conversation with other people. But for my purposes, to keep things simple, I'm just going to say it's Plato talking. At any rate, Plato says, and I'm using the Benjamin Jowett translation here, but he says, quote, "Behold, human beings living in an underground cave, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the cave. Here they have been from their childhood, and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move, and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning round their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way, and you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. And do you see, I said, men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking, others silent. And they see only their shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave." End quote. So Plato describes the situation. You have these people chained up, and they are staring at shadows on a wall. And to their knowledge, that is the totality of existence. That's all there is. That is life. That's reality for them. Plato says, quote, To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images." End quote. The traditional interpretation of this is that Plato sees this cave scenario as an allegory or a metaphor for the human condition. Most of us are imperfect humans who think we have knowledge and wisdom and a grasp of what's going on in the world, but in reality, we are in a simulation of sorts. We are wrapped up in our own interpretation of things that is dark and twisted and probably incorrect. Most of us are unenlightened beings that are living a reality that is controlled by others who influence what we can see, hear, and think about. We think we're seeing the truth of reality, but in actuality, there is an entire world of light outside the cave that we have no idea how to even begin to comprehend. So most of us think we're living in reality, but in Plato's view, we're chained down in a cave somewhere just staring at shadows with no idea that there's a whole other world out there to be discovered. Plato then asked the question, what would happen if a prisoner was released from the cave? Just as an aside, I noticed Plato uses the word released and not escaped. This could be connected to Plato's belief that it is the duty of the enlightened to go back and rescue the unenlightened. It may be difficult or impossible to escape the cave and reach enlightenment on your own without help, at least in Plato's view. But anyways, Plato says that upon reaching the outside of the cave, the prisoner's mind will actually fight tooth and nail against this new reality. The prisoner will be perplexed, doubt this new reality, suffer sharp pains, and think that the old world was more real than this one. It will take time to adjust to the light of knowledge and truth. Plato says, quote, "And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains, the glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being and his eye is turned towards more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away to take in the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he's forced into the presence of the sun himself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities." End quote. So in Plato's view, at first, when exposed to a new reality or a newer truth and a better truth, the prisoner will rebel against it and try to revert back to the old way of understanding shadows on the cave wall. But eventually the prisoner will slowly begin the process of adjusting to the outside world, and will eventually see the sun as the cause of all things and the source of all knowledge and goodness and truth. Here the sun becomes a sort of metaphor for truth and enlightenment, maybe even religious imagery and God if you are a religious person. Medieval church scholars loved Plato for this reason, among others. Eventually, in Plato's view, with the help of a caring instructor, the prisoner will begin to understand what's going on outside the cave and begin the process of being enlightened. But after reaching enlightenment, you might think the prisoner's journey is over. But according to Plato, it's not. The former prisoner would begin to pity those who were still in the cave. It seems only right to feel bad for them and to want to go back and free them and tell them, hey guys, the real world is outside the cave and the stuff you think is real is just shadows being thrown on a wall. The former prisoner would want to break the news that these people are prisoners. They're living in a simulation, and a pretty horrible one at that. Sadly for the rescuer, according to Plato, the prisoners actually won't take kindly to being told that everything they know is a lie. Sometimes a comforting lie is more desirable than a hard truth. Think about the things that the prisoners might care about. Imagine them congratulating each other on guessing which shadows would appear next, or bragging about how much knowledge of the shadows they had, or inventing rewards and punishments in their own reality as they're chained there staring at the wall. And then imagine them being told all of these things that they hold dear and all of these things that they care about are total nonsense in the real world. In Plato's mind, this seems to be, again, some sort of allegory or metaphor for the unenlightened life that many people in his view live. If you were to zoom out of your life for a second, how much of the stuff that we worry about and care about as humans actually really matters? Are the worries and the desires and the things we care about really important? Or are they just shadows on the wall of a remote cave? What would we say to the person who rips us away from our pleasant fantasy lives? Something tells me it might not be thank you. As Plato continues the story, he begins to talk about the now enlightened with goodness and truth and experience outside the cave, that now enlightened former prisoner going back to rescue the other prisoners. But first of all, he will have a tough time readjusting to the cave and readjusting to the dark after spending time in the light. This could be Plato's way of saying that educating others and helping to spread knowledge and truth can be way more difficult than it seems. And second of all, most of the prisoners will actually resist, maybe even violently. This seems to be the point in the story where you can draw some obvious parallels to democratic Athens and its treatment of Socrates. In Plato's view, Socrates tried to bring enlightenment to Athens and was killed for it by the everyday people that he views as very similar to the prisoners in his allegory of the cave, refusing to accept the truth and goodness and enlightenment, and instead choosing their own personal reality of shadows on a wall. And it's interesting because the reality is that when the former prisoner goes back to the cave and tells the prisoners about the outside world, they will think he's completely crazy, and probably for good reason. They have no experience with this outside world, and to them it would sound far-fetched and nonsensical. For these reasons, Plato views the former prisoner who goes back to help the others as incredibly noble. He knows it's going to be a difficult, if not impossible job, yet he still goes to do his best to educate others. This mirrors Plato's personal belief in the importance of education and the duty of the enlightened to go back and help those in need. But there are so many obstacles to becoming enlightened. You are going to need help to get out of the cave. You're going to have to go through that adjustment period once out of the cave. You're going to need to have the desire to go back in the cave and help others, where you will have to readjust to being in the dark and perhaps even deal with violent prisoners who are refusing to believe what you tell them. But if you can do all of this, in Plato's view, you can reach what he calls the idea of good. He says, quote, Whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort, and when seen, is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. End quote. Again, reaching this ideal of good is so tough because there are two ways to become lost and confused. You can be confused going from the dark into the light, but you can also become confused and revert back to your old ways when you go from the light to the dark. The true master, in Plato's view, can do both. Engage with the idea of good and the world of knowledge and truth outside the cave, but also be able to go back into the darkness, into the cave, and educate the people who need it by speaking about it on their level and on a level that they will understand. This key idea informs Plato's political belief in what he calls Philosopher Kings, who rule for the sake of the unenlightened and the uninformed. The business of the state should be to enlighten as many people as possible with truth and goodness and knowledge. Basically, it comes down to the idea that, in Plato's view, we can't forget about the people in the cave. Many people might be able to get out of the cave and reach some form of truth and goodness, but what really matters and what really makes a wise leader for Plato is the person who goes back into the cave to help others. Plato says that rulers should be rich in virtue and wisdom, not silver and gold. Again, the way to do this is to have government that cares about people in the cave. Plato says, quote, "Each of you, when his turn comes, must go down to the general underground abode and get in the habit of seeing in the dark. When you have acquired the habit, you will see 10,000 times better than the inhabitants of the cave, and you will know what the several images are and what they represent, because you have seen the beautiful and just and good in their truth. And thus our state, which is also yours, will be a reality, and not a dream only, and will be administered in a spirit unlike that of other states, in which men fight with one another about shadows only, and are distracted in the struggle for power, which in their eyes is a great good. Whereas the truth is that the state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager, the worst." End quote. Obviously, Plato didn't have a very high opinion of the politicians and the leaders of the state during his time, and you have to think if he time traveled to the modern day, his opinion probably wouldn't change much either. Ultimately, the allegory of the cave is a beautiful way for Plato to summarize most of what he believes. The importance of education, the idea of a world of forms, and that what we are experiencing as reality is only imperfect representations of ideas. The importance of knowledge and the importance of experience to attain knowledge is something that's important to Plato. This idea we talked about of philosopher kings and how they should rule and how they should avoid the common pitfalls and trappings of power that most politicians seem to exhibit. Plato talks about the duty of the enlightened to help the unenlightened and much more. But back to the focus of the episode, it seems that the allegory of the cave gives us a first, very early look at the idea of living in a simulation, which has become a lot more popular recently with pop culture and comic book movies and other movies and so on. The Matrix and The Truman Show being two somewhat older but still relevant popular examples. And Plato spends much time talking about the person who is released from the cave and reaches enlightenment. But I've always wondered about the prisoners who were still trapped in the simulation. You could have a reading of the Allegory of the Cave where it seems like Plato almost pities them, and at times maybe even disdains them for their ignorance and their inability to get out of the cave. But what if nobody ever came back to release them? What if they were stuck there forever? What should they do? Can you still live a meaningful life inside the cave? Is there a way to acquire virtue and wisdom in the cave? And maybe on a deeper level, who's to say that the outside of the cave isn't also another simulation, a more elaborate version of the very cave you thought you just escaped? Some modern philosophers think this last idea might not be as far-fetched as you might think. In fact, philosopher Nick Bostrom has said that based on a probability argument that he's made, it's actually incredibly likely that you and I at this very moment are living in a simulation of some sort. Bostrom explains the basic logic behind his argument. Quote, "Many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists, predict that enormous amounts of computing power will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many simulations. Suppose that these simulated people are conscious, as they would be if the simulations were sufficiently fine-grained, and if a certain quite widely accepted position in the philosophy of mind is correct. Then it could be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. Therefore, if we don't think that we are currently living in a computer simulation, we are not entitled to believe that we will have descendants who will run lots of such simulations of their forebears." End quote. So Bostrom is saying a lot of things there, but what he's basically saying is this. He believes, as many people do in the philosophy of mind, that things other than human brains can be conscious. So think about something like the robots from Westworld. And in the philosophy of mind, this actually isn't that controversial of an idea. So we have to accept that if we want to keep going. But he then says he also believes that computing power will eventually get to a ridiculously powerful level if we keep advancing as a civilization, which also isn't that controversial. He therefore argues that one of three things is possible in the future. Bostrom says, look, only one of these three possibilities can be true. Possibility one is that as a human race, we go extinct long before becoming advanced enough where we can start running these simulations. Possibility two is that we become a super advanced simulation, but we just don't want to run simulations like this, maybe for ethical reasons, or maybe because it would just be boring to us at that advanced stage of development. And then possibility three is that we do advance to a very sophisticated level, and we are running these simulations, and it's basically the Wild West. And if that possibility is true, then just based on the numbers of all the conscious minds that have ever existed, most of them at that point would probably be inside of these simulations. So if that ends up being the case, it's probably more likely that you're in a simulation than not in a simulation. If his idea is accurate, Bostrom poses many seemingly outlandish ideas about the nature of reality that suddenly become a lot more interesting. Reality could actually contain different levels of reality, basically simulations inside of simulations. Once a civilization inside of a simulation advances to a sophisticated enough level to create their own conscious minds, they create their own simulations, who eventually create their own simulations, and so on and so forth. Sort of an Inception-style metaphysics for the way the universe operates. And all of a sudden, seemingly outlandish theories of morality, like this levels of reality idea, could actually lead to things like a universal ethical imperative. Bostrom says, quote, "For example, if nobody can be sure that they are at the basement level, then everybody would have to consider the possibility that their actions will be rewarded or punished based perhaps on moral criteria by their simulators. An afterlife would be a real possibility. Because of this fundamental uncertainty, even the basement civilization may have a reason to behave ethically. The fact that it has such a reason for moral behavior would of course add to everybody else's reason for behaving morally, and so on, in a truly virtuous circle. One might get a kind of universal ethical imperative, which it would be in everybody's self-interest to obey, as it were, from nowhere." End quote. At any rate, the basic idea behind what Bostrom is saying is that it might be actually a lot more likely than you might think that we might be living in a simulation. And I think there might be a lot of assumptions and things that don't quite add up in his argument. But for our purposes here, it's less important that the argument is correct as it is just a way to start thinking about this idea of being in a simulation and how that might affect the way we live life. Much in the same way that Plato sort of created his own simulation with the Allegory of the Cave and used that as a way to sort of understand the world and perhaps gain wisdom and knowledge. So some modern-day philosophers take Bostrom's claim seriously and others less so, but if his idea that we very well could be in a simulation is true, how does that change how we live? It seems unclear for Bostrom and many others at first glance. I think Plato would probably advocate for trying your best to get out of the simulation, to climb out of the cave towards truth and knowledge and a closer version of reality, sort of like Neo in the Matrix. But not everybody agrees. One of the most well-known modern philosophers of mind, named David Chalmers, thinks that even if we are in a simulation, it actually wouldn't change much about the way we live. Some of the worries and concerns that we have now aren't that much different than the worries and concerns we would have if we lived inside the Matrix. His basic argument is that even if we are inside some sort of computer simulation, there's still a sense in which that is real. We're still here experiencing things, and we still understand the world in a very similar way than we do now. So he says, quote, "There are still tables, chairs, and bodies. These are made up fundamentally of bits and of whatever constitutes these bits. This world was created by other beings, but it is still perfectly real. My mind is separate from physical processes and interacts with them. My mind may not have been created by these beings, and it may not be made up of bits, but it still interacts with these bits. The result is a complex picture of the fundamental nature of reality. The picture is strange and surprising, perhaps, but it is a picture of a full-blooded external world. If we are in the Matrix, this is simply the way that the world is." End quote. What Chalmers is saying is that even if we are in a simulation, most of the beliefs that we have about the world are actually still correct. It's only the underlying nature of the world that would be different. And to be honest, we don't know anything about this anyway in our current understanding of reality. Chalmers points out we still don't know how the mind and the body truly interact. We can't actually be certain that other people around us are actually conscious. We can't truly be sure if there is a creator of the universe who controls our lives, whether that's a god or some sort of law of determinism or something like that. We could be upset that we're being deceived by being put in a simulation, but honestly, according to Chalmers, it's possible in our reality right now that there's other layers of reality we don't know about. Anyone who's seen a Marvel movie and sort of this idea of multiple universes might be nodding their heads. So to summarize, Chalmers says, quote, "Importantly, none of these sources of skepticism about other minds, the past and the future, our control over the world, and the extent of the world cast doubt on our belief in the reality of the world that we perceive. None of them leads us to doubt the existence of external objects such as tables and chairs in the way that the vat hypothesis is supposed to do. And none of these worries is especially tied to the matrix scenario. One can raise doubts about whether other minds exist, whether the past and the future exist, and whether we have control over our world quite independently of whether we are in the matrix. If this is right, then the matrix hypothesis does not raise the distinctive skeptical issues that it is often taken to raise." End quote. So bottom line for Chalmers is that if we are in some sort of simulation, maybe it's not as big a deal as someone like Plato might think. On the other hand, if we are in a simulation, you can't go wrong following Plato's blueprint to climb out of the cave into the idea of goodness and wisdom, maybe spend a little bit less time worrying about the things that don't matter in the grand scheme of things. But if you are stuck there and you know you're stuck there, philosopher Robin Hanson, somewhat humorously, goes through how we should live if we knew we were in a simulation and can't get out. He basically argues you should do whatever it takes to not be deleted by your simulation creators. Try to influence the creators somehow. Be obnoxious and entertaining. Try to make friends with celebrities because people like to simulate famous people. So if you're involved with them somehow, your chances of survival increase. Enjoy life, and so on and so forth. Hanson also says what I think goes beyond intentional or unintentional silliness, and he gives some good advice. Whether we're in a simulation or not, it always makes sense to live in the moment and enjoy the time you have with the people you have it with, because you never know when the cave might cave in on top of you. You never know when you might be deleted.